I would like then to invite Dr. Zulkifli Ahmad to talk about this issue, particularly on political Islam. Thank you.
Is there any chance that I could sit rather than
You can take, yeah, you can take, yeah. You can take this.
only stand in the evening giving ceramah? I'm very grateful that you are still giving me a chance. And especially preceded by Professor Haidar, I think I'm very privileged. And I thought my request was right, that I should have Professor Haidar speaking before me. Hashimi, Haidar Hashimi. Professor Haidar. Yeah, we go by the surname, yeah. Let me begin by Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And a very good morning still to all distinguished audience in this seminar on Islam, democracy, and secularism. Right. As I have stated earlier, that a lot of my task has been, in fact, amply delivered by Professor Hashimi. And I would now really attempt at maintaining the timeline that I'm given, and hopefully within, reasonable time allocated, that I will have to deliver all this note that I have come to jot down as Hadar was speaking. So allow me to begin by as well saying, much as secularism is not monolithic in the sense of having a one unified definition for all, so is going to be Islam or Islamism as a movement that many of you might have already, come to encounter with. I think we should provide no apology for that. The historical narratives has been very clear by Professor Haidar's deliberation, and he called it the dirty S word. For the first time I'm hearing this. Professor Haidar has been, I think he has maintained his intellectual stance, so to say, and in no way do I feel at all challenged by his position of, maintaining his intellectual integrity, sort of, by deliberating on secularism, and not in attempting to, in a way, take pot shot at Islamist movement. Thank you. And I think that is the way we're going to engage in this discourse, hopefully, till the end. Right. I'm going to take it, a lot has been said, actually. Yeah, and it is going to be quite difficult for me to pitch my deliberation, but I would dare put a few notes to you, before I go on the substantive thing. And hopefully I could, right. The Muslims' historical encounters with the West has unfortunately been one of nothing, short of an amicable one. That is to say it in a very, in a very positive way. The Muslim world has come to see secularism as essentially that of an experience, the encounter with colonialism and imperialism, yeah. And you might have already forgotten what Y.B. Zariel, in his introductory speech earlier, make a mention of the experience in Malaysia of the Pangkor Treaty of 1824, which essentially relegated the position of the Sultan to one that is confining themselves by the colonial British to be, only be responsible over rituals in the stricter sense of Islam as a religion. And that speaks a lot by way of the entire experience of the Muslim world, which essentially, all this experience is essentially Arab in nature, but we have our equivalents here in Malaysia, and it has been, that is the historical narrative, if I could put it simply. Unfortunately, just my battery went off. And there's a reason why I was wanting to sit down so that I could peep at my laptop. But then now it's going to be everything from my hopefully gigabyte memory. May I say this, that because the encounter with the West has essentially been one of subjugation, and post-colonial, the post-colonial construct of nation states, that has been, left over by post-colonial world order or the Muslim world, so fragmentized by the various colonialist power, be they French, British, and others. You have a position of Muslims be reminded of how, an intrusion of their entire, way of life. And in that process, I was hoping to, just quote one of intellectuals who, in the course of that interaction, almost turned around to be secularists. Ali Abdul Razak, for that matter, Professor Ali Abdul Razak, one who propounded and proposed and advocated that Islam has nothing to do with any political social order, and that the Prophet wasn't sent to finally establish a state order. And this is one typical example epitomized by Ali Abdul Razak, 1883 to 1966, I think he lived, and an Oxford graduate, that exemplified how, Muslims, the secularized mind of Muslim, proposing that Islam has nothing to do with state and attempt at forming a political order. I think that is only one example that I would like to cite by way of how within the Islamic polity, within the Islamic Muslim world experience, there are, of course, those who have advocated for a secular state. And I must say in no uncertain term that perhaps you already have gathered from my various deliberation in other forums and platforms, I would want to be understood as it's essentially representing within the ideological Islamic milieu, if I could use that word, it's somewhere occupying a centrist position, not of neo-literalist, and as well not of neo-rationalist. Okay? Today you are really going to be bombarded by a lot of these bombastic terminologies, but I hope you can, it will take another forum for me to go at length to deliberate to you what is meant by the neo-literalists. Neo-literalists essentially that thinking, that schools of thought that take Islam in the literal, textual meaning and translation of the Quran as well, the prophetic tradition. Yeah, essentially exemplified by the so-called Salafi, but that is also not right actually. And I'm not going to be taking that position, nor do I also subscribe to totally a rationalist school of thought, or the neo-rationalist school of thought, the Mu'tazilats and others. But where I stand, personally, I don't think that I can represent my party in that sense, is one that is more familiar with you perhaps of late, is the Maqasidi school of thought, the Ashatibi school of thought, the Maqasidul Ashariyah, or Maqasidul Ashariyah. Yeah? So that's where I'm coming from. And I will want to make no apology to take that position, but I think that would be the most positive way forward for Islamists, because as you know very well, there are the literalists and the neo-literalists that has denounced democracy as essentially un-Islamic and antithetical to the Tawhidic worldview. I don't have to go at length to deliberate on that. So I must make my position very clear, that I'm coming from that position of always referring and basing myself on textual thing, but taking a contextualized or a contextual approach in all my deliberations. So because of that, I do not have to, at all, dwell on whether Islam and democracy is compatible. I think we have passed that stage decades ago, right? So we're going to move forward with how Professor Hashimi has deliberated, and I think he had actually brought to us and update us over this precarious relationship of democracy, of a tripartite Islam, democracy, and secularism, and finally coming with Professor Alfred Stephan earlier, of what I really, would want to do, go on a further discourse on understanding the twin tolerations of state and church and the state, and because I think that would be the most positive way forward. Because I have well-wishers, friends, who are before Mu'tamar, I'm not quite sure now, coming to me and say, hey, you guys in PAS is the Islamic Party of Malaysia, you're good, but please, if you could not have Islam on board with you in your political involvement, could that be possible? I say, yes, it could very well be possible not to have Islam with PAS, but PAS will be equal, if not worse, than UMNO. I'm not intending to bring down UMNO, please. Yeah? Because they have brought down themselves enough. What I'm saying is, it is the Islamic principles and precepts that make PAS. And I had a lot of consolation in the way, when I'm listening to Prof. Hashimi, on his deliberation of what actually, would really be the way forward for a positive engagement of Islamists within the ambits of democracy and electoral process. I think that is most positive, because he is very kind to the West. In putting it in a very diplomatic language, but nonetheless putting it loud and clear, that the West seems to only understand democracy when it fits and it serves them. And I think the experience in Algeria, the experience in Tunisia, the experience in Egypt right now, more than amply vindicated my proposition, okay, and his as well. So now let me just get to the more substantive thing on Islamism. Much as secularism is not monolithic, so is Islamism and Islamists. Islamism is not a coinage of Islamism anyway. Islamism is not a coinage of the ulama. Islamism is a coinage of, if I may use the word, the Western social scientists. Namely, if I could just, of the French Paleopolitical Islam, Professor Oliver Roy, as an example, that defines political Islam as the political project of Islamists to finally have Islam in an embodiment of the state and power. So Islamism is a political project quite different from the rest of the Muslim or Islam. As if Islam is inadequate, that you got to give a prefix of political Islam to Islam. You get the point? Coming from my perspective, coming from a Tawhidic worldview of Islam, Islam could not, for one moment be separated from its political dimension in its total embodiment of Islam as a way of life. It's just not the Islamists understanding Islam this way. It's the entire Muslim world. It's the entire, each and every Muslim. But of course, as to its commitment to undertake this so-called political involvement or political project that is, that is by way of, if I can use the word, that is, is a question of opportunity, it's a question of whether it's direct or indirect, whether it's in a partisan way or whether in the civil society ways and others. So now let me just say that again. It is a conviction of Islamists, who have right now totally embraced democracy. For the fact that democracy is much intrinsic in the worldview of Islam. The cardinal principle of democracy, which is essentially of check and balance, is enshrined in the Quran, if I may quote the word, if I may quote a verse. In this verse, that essentially means that had not God, had not Allah Almighty check and balance the transgression and tyranny of one group by another, the entire world will be in dissension and tumult. So clearly that pronounces the cardinal principle of democracy in the Islamic polity, in the Islamic worldview, in the Islamic political thought. Yeah, and they were literally arguing with me in other forums, and they are PhD holders, I don't have to mention them or the organization, but arguing with me saying that, hey, look, democracy could only be used as a darura. Meaning it is only used as an exception. Within the Islamic jurisprudence, there is a thing called the exceptional cases. So democracy is right now being used or understood by these literalists. I used the word literalists earlier, the Harfiya school of thought. Essentially them claiming that, democracy is not Islamic, but it could be made use of, remember that word, in a exceptional emergency kind of situation. But I say this country is run by democracy all this while. Because in emergency, in the rule of emergency, in the rule of ad-darura, in the jurisprudence you have ad-darura tubihul mahzurat. Only in emergency situation you are permissible to do, what is not. As for example, if you don't have anything to eat, you are allowed to eat, pork, and you are allowed to, So that is in dire need, The jurisprudence allows you the exception called al-istisna, the rule, the exception to the rule. So you have this law called ad-darura. And ad-darura is tubihul mahzurat, allows for the things that are otherwise not permitted. However, if you only understand democracy from this ad-darura's context, then ad-darura as well also calls for ad-darura tuqaddar biqadariha. That using the ad-darura, you could only use it in a time frame, or if you eat, if you have to eat pork or other that are not permissible, you cannot be eating it for until until you are full and you can taking it on a longer time. Timeline. You got to just do it as for to survive that dire situation. But democracy is not like that. And this country has been run, by democracy or managed by this political setup of democracy for all this while. So I think I will not go into that any longer, but I'm giving you, I'm re-emphasizing the fact that Islamic democracy is not at all, in contravention at loggerhead. Yeah? And I think we have gone past that discourse for a long time now. However, what become the challenge of Islamists in the political involvement of democracy? I think that was what I wrote some time back, an article in The Edge called Political Islam at the Crossroad in Malaysia. And I reminded all Islamists that, the way forward for Islamist political party would critically depend on, whether they are able to engage, as alluded by Professor Hashimi earlier. Yes, we are coming from transcendental values. Yes, all our principle and precept is essentially God-given. However, Islamists or the political players of Islamic political parties must understand that they could not, in the name of God, get support and mandate of the people. They have got to be in that intense contestation of advocating their policies and programs and get others, the entire segment of voters, electorals and citizenry and riot to vote for them. Not because it's coming from God Almighty, but it provides for the best, and justice and the good, the common good, al-maslahah, for the entire citizenry, the Muslims and non-Muslim alike. This is the language that Islamists must understand. For whatever that they advocate, they must understand that they are going to convince. Their political messaging must be able to communicate the efficacy and the goodness. Because, as I have written in this piece, that they could not, in a religious theocratic stance, get mandate because they represent God on earth. Do you get what I mean? Yeah. And that is the problem of Islamists throughout the Muslim world. The inability to engage in a discourse and a language that is comprehensible enough by all. You see that? You see semblance of that in Egypt, in the Muslim Brotherhood. I said it without any qualms. The idea of getting a veto power right by the president, by the former president, democratically elected President Dr. Mursi, was one that really brings about, Professor Hashimi, I hope you don't disagree with me on that one, was the inkling, was the semblance of what Professor Hashimi alluded earlier, that, given a, whatever, Islamists or even Christian for that matter, any other ideologically based or religiously based political party, they have got to win contestation, and thereafter not subvert democratically elected government and parliament because it is against their principle and that their principle is coming from God Almighty. This is the greatest challenge of Islamists. And in that language, and that language alone, Islamists must not just transform themselves, but must understand these demands of democratic engagement. And I think, in the embodiment of Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi in Tunisia and the semblance of many others now, Islamists are getting more savvy and better able to engage in the democratic process in a language and in a discourse that are making them more electable and comprehensible. You getting me? Yeah, okay. So that would be, to me, the greatest stumbling block of Islamists moving forward. And more so, when Islamists are taking a coalition kind of engagement, Islamists, forging coalition politics, particularly I'm giving the Malaysian context, demands of coalition politics is a lot more problematic, a lot more precarious. And until and unless Islamists are imbued with a Marxistic approach of analyzing, problems in society, moving away from just the literal interpretation of what is nusus or what is textual and what is haram, what is halal, rather moving, transcending above, the do's and don'ts, and moving ahead with what is the wisdom behind all this? What is the precept? What are the principles? What are the underlying, what are the overarching intention of Sharia, of the Islamic law? That must be made to be highlighted. And I think I dare say that in the discourse of hudud, Islamists come face to face, particularly PAS in Malaysia. And I think, besides whatever that has, we pass by way of the crisis currently, I think that this is always the Achilles heel of Islamists. How do they communicate their messages, namely the issue of the punitive Islamic law, the Qanun Jinayah Islamiyah, the punitive aspect of the Sharia, the punitive aspect of Sharia. The other aspect of Sharia, I think, no longer become a contestation, namely, the Islamic banking and finance and others, but particularly on the punitive aspect. So it is a challenge on Islamists, on the Islamic political party, to engage in an engaging position of just not, advocating your policy, but advocating it democratically, advocating it intellectually, advocating it in a manner that is comprehensible and understandable by others, in the sense of, for example, in the efficacy of the punitive Islamic law, for example, and bringing about a contrast of the efficacy from a global statistic of crime, of theft, of robbery, from the so-called failed Muslim states of Pakistan or others, as compared to the more OECD countries, for that matter. And then you will be face to face to understand whether there is any chance of the Islamic punitive law, ever be at least debated in Parliament, and then take it forward. That if ever it gets supported, it is supported in the name of democracy. It is supported through a vote, and everyone has a chance to determine whether this be part of the entire, laws of the country. So I know it's most unpopular to give this as an example, but I will give it nonetheless, because I know it will keep cropping up and raising its head, and usually, at the worst of time, just before a general election. So I for one, as an Islamist, as a Democrat as well, as someone who I said is neither neo-literalist nor neo-rationalist, I stand to with my brothers like YB Zairil from DAP and others, that we must iron this out, in a manner that can bring about the twin toleration, in a manner that can make them understand. If ever it get rejected, be it. But there must be that discourse, there must be that engagement, there must be that debate, that dialogue, that national conversation. That Islamists, like all others, are entitled to. I think this is why it's so critical that when you are a Democrat, that you're just not a Democrat when it serves you. In a more voltaic way, in a more voltaic philosophy, if I may say, if I may remind you, I may disagree with you, but I will defend, to my last, your right to advocate your conviction and your ideology. I think, distinguished audience, I think I would take it, limit myself to this in my first round. If I may just briefly, summarize my deliberation earlier. I started off by saying that I endorse most of what has been deliberated by Professor Hashimi, in the sense of, enhancing an effort to see democracy in its true sense of embodiment. And quoting Alfred Stephen at the end, I think that twin toleration by way of a thesis is one that is most promising and invigorating, if I may use that word. And as an Islamist, I feel that would be almost like mandatory and a must that we move forward in that direction. And there is no issue about democracy in Islam. And Islamists, that's my last point, Islamists must now understand that to engage in a democracy, to engage in a way that has been, the usual term that we use is muwajjah silmiyah, to engage in a constructive engagement of democracy, Islamists must, be able to craft, contextualize, and advocate their policies, program, and even concept, not coming from just a transcendental, origin, but to argue, convincingly, objectively, intellectually, why they must be given a chance, why they must be allowed to be a critical player in nation rebuilding and human civilization remaking. I thank you.
Can I comment on his remarks?
Okay, yeah. Dr. Hashimi.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your comments. I think we're all, me and you are in basic agreement. But I would like to just sort of push you a little bit in the following direction. I think what political Islamists need to do is go beyond simply saying that we need an Islamic approach or a democratic approach or a textual approach. What I think fundamentally is needed is an ethical approach in terms of how do our policies and our positions advance a set of goals that are good for everyone in society, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. I think focusing on the question of the ethics of our policies helps us advance and I think reconcile some of the tensions. Since this session is called Political Islam versus Secularism, there's been a recent development that I'm going to talk more about in the afternoon session that speaks specifically to this relationship between political Islam and secularism. If you're interested in it, it's worth looking at and reading. I think one of the most interesting developments on this relationship between political Islam and secularism has to do with what is happening right now in Tunisia. How many people here know who Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi is? Okay, everybody knows. Okay, good. Of course, if you know, Sheikh Ghannouchi, Rashid Ghannouchi gave a speech. I encourage you to go track it down and look at it. You can email me, I'll send it to you. I talk about it in the preface of my book. He gave a speech on Islam and secularism in March 2012. The Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and he sort of, just to summarize the speech, he basically, says, look, secularism in the context of Tunisia, informed by a very draconian, hostile, anti-religious and anti-Islamic view, is something that has produced a lot of victims and has been very ugly for Tunisians, particularly practicing and pious Tunisian Muslims. He doesn't like the concept of secularism. But then he went deeper and he said, what does actually secularism propose to advance? He said, if secularism means that there should be equality in society for all citizens, if secularism sort of means that the state, like it did under the regime of Ben Ali, the state should not dominate and impose and enforce its views on society, and likewise that society should not impose its views and should respect sort of democratic outcomes. If that's what secularism is geared toward advancing, then he says, as an Islamist, I have no problem with that. And in fact, what's so fascinating about the Indonesian experiment is not only is Sheikh Ghannouchi a leading, prominent, and respected figure of political Islam, but it's the role of his political party that, in my view, is largely responsible for Tunisia's democratic advances and gains. It's the one country today that really leaves us any measure of hope in terms of what's left of the Arab Spring. And what's really fascinating about the Tunisian experiment is the writing of the new Tunisian constitution that was passed earlier this year. And when all the political parties gathered around the table to discuss, the new constitution, the immediate issue that came up was the question of the role of Sharia, or Islamic law, in the Tunisian constitution. Tunisia has a legacy of French, colonial and imperial rule, and there's a sizable, small minority, but very vocal percentage of the Tunisian political society that is very animated and captured and informed by secularism. And so when this question of the role of Sharia in the Constitution came up, it became a deeply polarizing and divisive debate. And Ennahda wanted to have some mention of it in the Constitution, but to the credit of Rashid Ghannouchi and Ennahda, they had an internal party discussion. And they said, look, let's not get sidetracked by textual references, by the exact implementation and insistence upon having Sharia enshrined in our Constitution. Let's talk about political values. Let's talk about political principles. And they reached a decision that because of the deeply divisive nature of the question of Sharia, the word Sharia, another, for some people, dirty S word, they said, let's remove it away. We will not insist upon this being part of the Constitution. We are simply happy as an Islamist party with maintaining the preamble that previously existed in the Constitution, that Islam is the official religion of this country. And let's push the process of democracy and rights and community building and an ethical sort of constitutional writing process forward. And so it was a deeply divisive issue from within his own party, because many people said, look, we've been fighting, we've been dying, we've been killed for the last 60, 70 years because we insisted on, religious values and Sharia being part of our legal code. Now you're saying that we shouldn't have it. It was a difficult debate. The Ennahda party, the majority view, sided with Ghannouchi. And looking back, one can say that that decision advanced the project of democracy in Tunisia. And now, when I go to Tunisia quite regularly, and when I was in Tunisia earlier this year, the constitution had just passed, and Sheikh Ghannouchi, as a leading political Islamist, got up and gave a speech saying that this constitution is really the embodiment of the best desires, wishes, and dreams that the Tunisian Islamist movement had from its inception in the beginning of the 20th century. We wanted the values that are in this constitution: freedom of expression, the right for people to practice their religion, a just government, division of powers, accountable rule. That's what we wanted for. That's what we fought for. That's what he spent 20 years of his life in exile for. And that was, I think, a very sophisticated political Islamist interpretation of political events in Tunisia that allowed for the Tunisian Ennahda movement to accept the current constitution that does not mention the word secularism, but functionally, if you're a secularist and you need to have that principle recognized, functionally, the Tunisian constitution that was passed is, I would call it functionally politically secular. It's also, I would argue, functionally inherently Islamic, because it's rooted in ethical values that allows for these basic principles to advance themselves. And so now you see Tunisia making advances that many other societies have not been able to make, largely because of the wise and courageous leadership of Ennahda and Ghannouchi. And I think there's deep lessons there for Muslims around the world, those particularly who come out of a political Islamist, I think, background. Lessons to learn, lessons to study. You don't need to take it from me. I encourage you to invite leading Tunisian sort of political scientists and actors and members of Ennahda to come and talk about how they manage this particular problem, and perhaps there's things that Malaysian society can learn.
Rizal?
Yeah, I'll quickly respond to that, perhaps to response to Prof. Hashimi's ethical proposition. That is exactly what the Islamism Malaysia is trying to do now. To just inform you, perhaps you have not, past is not within your radar of Islamist political thoughts by way of your studies. What we managed to forge together, is essentially a common policy framework, which, to me personally and to pass, is in fact the Sharia advocacy for governance, good governance, justice, accountability, transparency, addressing issues of within the context of mismanagement of the resources of the nation, crony capitalism and all the jazz. So I think in that sense, Islamists, the world over have come to understand that, for once upon a time, Islamists, were caught in that trap, which I dare say, when they call for Islam, al-Islam huwa al-hal, that Islam is the solution, and that solution has always been like Sharia in the context of a punitive law. Unfortunately, that was the case. And then that advocacy for the Islamic State. I'm not against it, but I think that is limiting the role of Islam. And now, for your information, we advocate this, beginning 2008, we advocate this, we are now advocating our political messaging on creating a benevolent state. The baldatun tayyibatun Rabbul Ghafur kind of, and that essentially, resonated well with our other partners, because that is essentially bringing all the positive, precepts and the teachings of Islam, particularly on governance, because within the state power, there's nothing much of matters of faith, an article of faith. When you come to rule, it is all about governance. And mind you, if I may quote Ghanushi's concept of al-faragh, what can be translated as space, basing itself to that prophetic tradition or hadith of the Prophet. Once he was in Medina, after he migrated from Mecca, he saw the Medinan, doing this cross-pollination of their date trees. And he commented, thinking that it's sort of revealed, it's the divine thing. The Medinan, the Ansar, and did not want to, offend the Prophet, so they did not do that cross-pollination for that year. And the harvest was bad. And they came back to the Prophet and saying, "Oh, the Prophet of Allah, you told us this and we didn't do it. You told us not to do this cross-pollination thing and we didn't do it." And then the Prophet came with this very important, tradition, important hadith of the Prophet when he says, "Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum." You should know better your affairs of life. If ever you want to understand this as a secular, mundane, temporal, affairs, you can conclude that way. But what is meant, in the bigger context of Sharia, the Sharia has got things that are clearly laid down. These are what is known as the athawabits, the non-changeables. And in matters of politics, it is the thoughts of all fuqaha, they are ijma on this, they are consensus on this, that in the construct of the Sharia, there is a thing called aqidah, matters of faith, then akhlaq, and then mu'amalats. And mu'amalats are affairs of the people. And politics is under the category of mu'amalats. And in the category of mu'amalats, what the Prophet said, "Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum," if I may, allude to it as well. You have a situation where that ijtihad, based on whatever, textual things of the Quran, or no textual thing, these are totally new and of masalah, mursalah kind of thing, that are new did not happen in the time of the Prophet. But nonetheless, the Muslim is going to face it, and they face it with ijtihad or intellectual renewals. And this is why we believe that in the context of political involvement, the realm of ijtihad and renewals, the realm of engagement, far exceeded that small, things that are very textual in nature in the sense of faith. How many times in the parliamentary debate would ulama needed to be called to pronounce kind of, is it halal or haram? It's not. There hardly any occasion, hardly any bills, to be debated that's like that. So this is why we believe that the way forward is for Islamists is to really understand and advocate the principles, the ethical values of the Sharia. And how we get to advocate and advance this will depend on how successful we are in trying to get the mandate and the trust of the entire, just not the Muslim. By the way, we have in our party a wing is made up of 100% non-Muslim. Oh, really? 100%, people of other faiths. I don't like to use this word non-Muslim. They are either Chinese or Indian, and they are Buddhist, Christian, and Hindus. And this is how we feel that the way forward for Islamists is to really make ourselves comprehensible, I keep saying it, electables, by advancing, as you said, the ethical principle, values that are all enshrined in the Sharia. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zul.